In this video lecture, we're going to look at Constructive and Destructive Deviance in Organizations by Danielle Warren. So we're going to look at a new way at conceptualizing deviance and how we can think about whether it's constructive or destructive. So an overview of the argument put forward by Warren is that first, in management literature, deviant behavior is characterized in one of two ways typically, just negative or positive. And that there's not really a unifying conceptualization of deviance in organizations, which means that in the literature, there's a divide over how to think of deviance and really when we can say deviance is negative or positive. So, Warren argues that these streams of research need to be united in order to ensure that the theory and managerial recommendations are useful and comprehensive. So it's going to be a synthesis of past literature to try to come up with a unifying conception, right, of deviance. Now this is going to require specificity of reference groups and more integrative studies, that address a broader concept of deviant behaviors and an explicit statement on the normative foundations for judging behavior with an understanding that some groups ignore the context in which reference groups operate. So let's first think about how to define deviance. One group of social theorists claim that deviant behavior is the product of social construction and it doesn't require a behavioral component. That we define deviant behavior based on whether or not a group says behavior is deviant or not. So Warren says, thus, if a group labels an individual a deviant, the individual is considered a deviant despite the lack of evidence that the person's behavior departs from the norm. So it's completely based not on actual behavior, but on norms established by groups. Now, other kinds of social theorists or sociologists associate the term deviance with specific behaviors. That deviance arises because there's a divide between society's goals and feasible means for achieving these goals, right? When someone just does not perform the behavior that is supposed to achieve that goal. Now, there are pros to both of these, of course, right? With the social laboring theorists, what we get from that is, of course, that we get a normative account, right? Where a group says this is what is considered or not considered deviant behavior. And if someone does not do something, that is recommended, then that is not, that is deviant behavior. It's not in compliance. Now, on the other hand, right, what's good about the focus on behavior is that we can actually empirically look at what people are doing. So on the one hand, we have a focus on principles in a sense, and the other with behaviors. Now, Warren thinks a better conception of deviance synthesizes the behavioral approach with the focus on actions and the labeling approach with the focus on norms. So, to begin making sense of this synthesis, first, norms summarize the behavior of the reference group. They describe what it is that a group entails, what really the rationalization of the group is, what they seek to do, what they're based on. Now, informal norms are actual or regularly exhibited behaviors that aren't exactly established by like an institution or an organization. And this can involve, for example, work routines. What I might do in myself and how I do my work throughout the day. Formal norms, though, are expected behaviors. So rules, procedures, and codes of conduct, things like that are established, of which then, of course, I can deviate to some extent from that in how I act in following out, according to the guidelines of the rules and so on. Now, understanding reference groups in relation to norms requires considering multiple group memberships because we occupy memberships in different kinds of groups that sometimes norms can conflict with those groups. So Warren says, at any moment, an employee needs to act with regard to the behaviors endorsed by multiple groups. Within an organization, we can imagine individuals who conform to their work group norms, only to deviate from the organization's rules or regulations. So, for example, A financial trader who harasses another trader deviates from the norms of the financial exchange, but may conform to the informal norms of his trading crowd. So we need a better consensus about for standards, really, for judging deviance. So one line of reasoning is that any departure from a norm is destructive. This suggests that the norms of the reference group are moral simply because most of the reference group members behave in a way that is consistent with the norms, that it is the groups that establish the norms themselves. Now, Warren thinks we should object to this as a final way of judging deviance, because such logic can result in moral relativism, that it just says whether or not a group says something is good or not is whether it's good or not. And that what this does is not address the context in which the reference group operates. So what is the context in the society, in the larger society? What is the context in the globe within how the group operates? Well, if the group just says this is the norm, well, then that's the norm and that's how people should behave, right? That leads to a kind of relativism. Another line of reasoning categorizes deviance, comparing it departures from reference group norms to the norms of another group. So it's a bit more referential. So Warren says, for instance, if an individual departs from a work group norm that supports workplace harassment, then the deviance is regarded as positive. But we still can object to this, because this conception of deviance does not account for the societal dangers of employee compliance, like polluting rivers, just because that's the norm for a group. Or, even worse, if legal standards are used as a reference, it's difficult actually to extend this to international businesses where country legal standards may end up conflicting. So, the organizational and legal approaches present theoretical shortcomings because they lack inclusiveness. To achieve this inclusiveness, Warren advocates using both hypernorms and organizational norms. So, we should use global standards, such as hypernorms. Unlike universals, where one person or one group states what people worldwide should believe, how they should act, the idea of a hypernorm is that it's more of a social contract, a global social contract that should attempt to capture people's values or beliefs worldwide. So what we all would agree to, hypothetically, in a rational consensus. Hypernorms are inclusive because they incorporate the values and beliefs belonging to multiple cultures as well as multiple ethical theories. Warren says, thus, hypernorms are pluralistic because they capture multiple normative approaches to ethical theory, including rights, justice, utilitarianism, duties, and virtue. And so what we do is we compare both hypernorms with organizational norms to determine if someone is acting in compliance or being deviant, and whether that deviance is constructive or destructive, and whether that compliance is constructive or destructive. So what does this look like? Well, we have this nice table that we can use to determine this. So behavior that falls outside both sets of norms, where we have reference group and hypernorms, is destructive deviance. Warren says, for example, if the reference group is a business organization, then such behavior may include embezzlement. Behavior that falls within reference group norms but deviates from hypernorms is destructive conformity. Warren says, in a business organization, this behavior may include following orders to sell an unsafe product. Behavior that falls within both sets of norms is constructive conformity, and most behavior actually is this. Finally, behavior that deviates from the reference group norms but conforms to hypernorms is constructive deviance. As Warren says, in a business organization, this behavior includes certain types of whistleblowing.